This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Talia.
Hi, listeners.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of TNT Crimes and Consequences. Well, I am so excited to share with you and the listeners this story I have today because this is one of the most fascinating true crime stories that I have researched.
Ooh, that's quite the build-up.
This one involves murders in a cabin in the woods. This takes place in a small town called Keddie. Keddie is so small that right now its current population is 65 people.
That is small.
Keddie is located in Plumas County, California, which is approximately 1.5 hour drive from Reno, Nevada, and 2.5 hours from Sacramento. So it's Northern California. There's one road that leads into Keddie, and it's the same road that leads out. In the first half of the 20th century, a resort was built in Keddie called the Keddie Resort. The owners of the resort wanted to take advantage of the fact that the Western Pacific Railroad had a stop in Keddie, so they envisioned this resort being the new place to go for swimming and all that fun outdoor activity. Unfortunately, Western Pacific Railroad closed down. There was no stop there. And this resort never turned out to be anything close to what the owners envisioned. The owners of Keddie Resort ended up renting out the cabins as low-income housing options for the locals. Keddie had a hotel, which had a bar, because you could have a town with 2 people and there's going to be a bar. One of the families that rented out a cabin, specifically Cabin 28, was a 36-year-old woman named Sue Sharp and her 5 children. Sue Sharp was born Glenna Sue Davis in 1945. She met a man named James Sharp. He was in the Navy, and the 2 of them got married and had 5 children. They had 3 boys and 2 girls, and they lived in Connecticut. James ended up being extremely violent and was physically abusive to Sue and to his 2 daughters. So as a result, Sue left him. She took herself and the 5 kids, and she eventually moved in 1979 all the way from Connecticut to a place called Quincy, California. The town of Quincy is about 7 miles from Keddie, and it's much larger. It's got about 1,500 people. Sue's brother Don lived in Quincy, so she moved to Quincy, California to be closer to him. She moved the kids into a trailer park where they lived for about a year. And then in November of 1980, she moved her children into Cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort. Now, I know I'm saying the word resort, but it hasn't been a resort for a really, really, really long time. It is more like a bunch of shacks. They have not been updated. The walls were described as like paper thin. They're pretty much run down. But the space was bigger than the trailer. And being that Sue had 5 kids, she needed more room. So that's why they moved into the Keddie Resort. If you were to look at the cabin from the front, it looks like a 1-story cabin. But as you walk around the side, you'll see a basement. Again, you can only really see that from the sides and the back. The cabin had 2 bedrooms. One was in the front of the cabin, then you have the living room, then you have the kitchen, and then you have a back bedroom. The basement doesn't have direct access to the inside of the cabin. In order to get from the basement into the cabin to, let's say, go to the bathroom, you have to walk up the back steps outside and come in through the back door. Johnny, Sue's 15-year-old son, he lived in the basement. It was unfinished. It was not a nice basement. And it was basically one room with a furnace, the water heater. And that's where Johnny lived. So for Johnny to get into the house, again, he had to walk outside and up the stairs. 15-year-old Johnny was deemed to be a little bit sassy, had a mouth on him. But again, he's a 15-year-old boy, so that's not surprising. On the first level, in one of the bedrooms, Sue shared it with her two daughters, Tina, who's 12 years old, and Sheila, who's 14. So all three girls shared one bedroom. In the other bedroom was Tina's younger sons, Ricky and Greg, who was 5. So that's a lot of players. She's got a lot of kids. But you got the girls in one bedroom, the little boys in another bedroom, and you got Johnny in the basement. In order to make ends meet, Sue worked part-time as a waitress at the local Elks. She also received money from the Navy in the form of $250, kind of like child support, I think. She got food stamps, and she got a small stipend from the California government for taking a typing class at the local college. So in essence, the Sharps were really poor. They did not have a lot of money. In March of 1981, after about 5 months of living in Cabin 28, the kids there and Sue there got to know the neighbors, and the children became friends with all the local kids. Sue was 36 years old at this time, and she didn't drink, and she didn't do drugs. She kind of kept to herself, but she did have quite a few boyfriends, considering there's only like a population of, 60 people in the town. On the night of April 11th, 1981, 15-year-old Johnny was hanging out with his 17-year-old friend Dana. Dana was known as a bit of a troublemaker, and he was in and out of a foster home. The two of them together went to the town of Quincy. They hung out in Quincy for the day. There was rumors that there was a teen party with alcohol and drugs that night, but it was never verified if Johnny and Dana went to that party. Now, Sue told the boys when it was time to come home, do not hitchhike home, which is always good advice, by the way.
That is very good advice.
However, they were spotted at a gas station asking for a ride, kind of hitchhiking home.
Because no one listens to their mom when they're 15.
Before going back to Cabin 28, they went to their friend Kathy's house, and then eventually they got a ride home sometime around 10:30. The person that dropped them off said that Dana and Johnny walked through the front door and that there weren't a lot of lights on, maybe either a little bathroom light or the TV, just a little light in the cabin. That same night, Tina and Sheila were hanging out at Cabin 27. Cabin 27 is literally 15 feet away from Cabin 28. 15 feet is very close. In Cabin 27 lived the Seabolt family. The Seabolts had a daughter named Alyssa, and she was friends with Sheila and Tina. So Sheila and Tina were hanging out with Alyssa. Mrs. Seabolt wasn't too impressed with Sue's parenting skills, so she wouldn't let Alyssa stay overnight at Tina and Sheila's house. But she really liked Tina and Sheila, so Tina and Sheila stayed over at their cabin all the time. In fact, Tina actually stayed over almost every Saturday night. On that particular night, April 11th, Tina went home about 7:30 to do dishes. Then she went back to the Seabolts. Tina was told by her mom she had to come home around 9:30, so Tina returned home at 9:30. She wasn't allowed to stay the night for whatever reason, but Sheila was allowed to stay the night. So Sheila stayed with Alyssa that night, 15 feet away in Cabin 27. Also at the house with Sue, besides Tina, was 5-year-old Greg, 10-year-old Ricky, and their 12-year-old friend named Justin. Justin lived in Cabin 26 with his mother and her stepfather, the Smarts. The three boys, Ricky, Greg, and Justin, were in the front bedroom, and they were watching the television show The Love Boat. After watching The Love Boat, they went to bed about 10 o'clock. Sue and Tina went to bed in the girls' bedroom. Sue slept on the bed nearest the door, and Tina slept on a bed next to it. The next morning was Sunday, April 12th. Sheila got up around 7 o'clock, and remember, she's at the Seabolts. She went back home because she wanted to go to church with the Seabolts and she wanted to change her clothes. She walked into the front door. Apparently, they never locked the doors because everybody knew everybody, right? When she opened the front door, she saw the most terrifying sight. There were 3 bodies sprawled out dead on the floor, and blood was everywhere. Sheila let out a horrifying scream and ran back to the Seabolts. The Seabolts didn't have a phone, so they went to the nearest cabin with a phone and then called the police. The Seabolt's teenage son, Jamie, he ran back to cabin 28 to see if anybody was alive because Sheila only opened the door, saw horrifying scene, and took off running.
I'm pretty sure that's what I would do.
Right, I'm not going to go investigate.
No, I'm not going to go investigate.
When Jamie went to cabin 28, he noticed the back door was ajar. He went inside, he saw the scene, and he went into the room where those 3 little boys were, Justin, Greg, and Ricky, and he found them alive. They were sleeping. He didn't want him to see the slaughter in the living room, so Sheila and Jamie Seabolt helped those little boys go out the bedroom window. The police were called, and Sheila also called her Uncle Don, her mom's brother, and he came immediately to cabin 28 too. When the police arrived, they looked at the crime scene, and they saw there was blood on the walls, blood on the floors, blood on the furniture, on the ceiling, on Tina's bed, on Sue's bed. It was on the doorknob of each bedroom, including the boys' bedroom. There was even blood on the handrail outside and by the back door. In the living room on the walls were bloody knife marks from what they believe was probably knives being thrown into the walls and then pulled out. The bodies were identified as 17-year-old Dana, 15-year-old Johnny, and one of the bodies had a blanket over it. When the police uncovered the blanket, they saw the deceased remains of Sue. In walking into the scene, the first victim you would see would be Johnny. He was closest to the door. Then next to Johnny on the floor was Dana. Dana was found bound at the ankles, connected to Johnny. He was wearing heavy brown hiking boots. He had corduroy jeans on, a sweater, and a long sleeve shirt. His shirt was soaked with blood. He had suffered multiple face and head injuries. His front teeth were fractured, but his cause of death was determined to be strangulation, manual. He'd been hit in the back of the head with a hammer multiple times. Some of the wounds inflicted on him were actually post-mortem wounds. The victims weren't only bound with electrical cord, they were also bound with 2 different types of medical adhesive tape. Dana's tape was really loose, so the bindings on Dana weren't really anything to secure him.
Maybe it was done after.
Maybe. You're a very intuitive person. You should have been a medical examiner or an investigator.
I should have.
An autopsy determined that the lividity that had occurred to Dana's body would mean that he had to have been positioned sitting when he died. It's very likely that Dana was sitting on this bench by the telephone, and that's where he died and then was moved post-mortem. Because of the various pools of blood that were located in the living room, the police know that the bodies were moved and staged.
That's just creepy.
They were positioned on the ground flat on their bellies.
I know, it's just weird.
Tied together. As I said earlier, Johnny was closest to the door. His wrists were bound, almost in a praying position with medical tape. Interestingly, though, there was no blood underneath the tape. It was all over the tape and all over his hands, but not underneath it, which means he probably wasn't wounded at the time he was tied up. He was found wearing his shoes, wearing the sweatpants he'd been wearing earlier. He had a vest on and a sweatshirt that was zipped up the front. His ankles were bound very tightly with electrical cord. All of the bindings that were electrical cords were taken from the girl's bedroom. They don't know where the medical tape came from. Johnny's autopsy determined he was stabbed twice in the chest with something small. It was at the most 5/8 of an inch wide. He'd been beaten about the head, and he had 7 lacerations on the left side of his scalp. His eye socket was broken, part of his skull was broken, and he had severe injuries to his brain. He had been stabbed in the throat, and his throat had been cut. Some of the wounds to his head were from a hammer, and they were inflicted on him after his death. Now, Sue received the most injuries of all 3 victims that were in the living room. Sue was laying on her side with a blanket over her. When the police removed this yellow blanket, they discovered that she was naked from the waist down. She was really tightly gagged. Whoever murdered her took off her underwear and basically jammed it into her mouth. Then they put a blue bandana into her mouth. And then they secured it all with medical tape that was placed over her mouth. She was wearing what was described as a muumuu, a blue muumuu, which she wears when she goes to bed. It had been lifted up over her waist. She had been bound differently than the boys. Her wrists were bound very tightly, and her ankles were bound, and then they were bound together in the front. So one of the cords was actually went all the way down the front of her chest by her crotch area and to her ankles, and they tied it so tight that her ankles were almost hoisted up to her wrists. If you can imagine, basically the binds made it so her legs and knees were pushed up to her chest. The gag that was in her mouth had no blood underneath it. So they know the injuries Sue sustained to her head, which there were a lot of, were caused after she was gagged. Sue's throat had been cut like Johnny's. On her head, there was an imprint of an .880 Daisy air rifle. She had been hit by the butt of this air rifle.
So she wasn't hit with the hammer?
She was also hit with a hammer.
And the butt of the rifle.
And the butt of the rifle. She was stabbed in the throat. She was stabbed multiple times in the chest. She was the only one gagged. Sue was the only victim to have defensive wounds. She wasn't raped, but her underwear were off. And police believe she was originally placed in a very sexually humiliating pose with her genitals exposed, yes, because her knees were splayed apart. Sue's teeth were busted loose in her mouth. Her breast had a large cut across it, and she eventually died from having her throat slit.
Man, there must have been blood everywhere.
There was blood everywhere.
Like, literally everywhere.
There was blood on the ceiling.
Ugh.
The extra sad part of this is Sue had a lot of blood on the bottom of her feet and even between her toes, which means that she was forced to walk around with blood all over the floor.
So she was probably killed last.
She was killed last.
Oh, how awful.
You're so intuitive today.
You know, I am a true crime podcaster, so.
I am really impressed.
That's really sad, though.
It is really sad.
Because I can't even imagine what she was going through seeing those boys murdered.
In examining the crime scene, it appeared that someone had came into the scene. They had covered Sue with a blanket after her death. Her body had been in rigor mortis, so she probably fell over to her side. It's very unlikely it would be the perpetrators that covered her because she wouldn't have been in rigor mortis at the time. That takes a few hours.
This story is just creepy.
The police were able to get a lot of evidence. There was a hammer that was there. There was a steak knife. Whoever used it stabbed it so hard that they bent that knife. Most likely the perpetrator or perpetrators, and I'll get to who we think did this, This is an unsolved case. I don't know if I mentioned that, but we're going to try to solve it today.
Oh, sweet.
Because you're on a roll.
Yeah, I am on a roll.
So you can tell me who did it in the end.
Hopefully. But it's officially unsolved.
It's officially unsolved. Whoever committed these crimes came prepared. They wore gloves. They brought their own hammers. But more than one hammer was used. They brought their own medical tape. They had to have brought an air rifle. They brought their own knives to kill these victims. There was no other blood from anybody else but the victims at the crime scene. So the perpetrators most likely never got injured. The sheriff of Plumas County, Doug Thomas, realized that this scene was way too overwhelming for any skills that he had in crime investigation. As a result, he called the California Department of Justice, the DOJ. Now, this is where it gets really weird. The DOJ, instead of sending homicide investigators, they sent 2 special agents from their organized crime unit to come to Keddie on a helicopter to investigate the scene.
Like organized crime like the mafia?
Yeah.
Okay, that's strange.
That's strange. By all standards, the ensuing investigation was subpar. It was almost a sham. I don't know if there is corruption with the police.
Maybe.
Or they're extremely unskilled. I am a strong supporter of the police, but I'm going to tell you, there's some dumbasses in this case. Police started the investigation by interviewing neighbors, and there was a couple in a few cabins down that said they heard a loud moan or maybe a scream about 1:30 in the morning, but then there was nothing else that followed, so they went back to bed. The police talked to the Seabolts in cabin 27, and Mr. Seabolt said that he got up at 5 a.m. to gather wood, and he said he didn't hear anything. In fact, all the people in cabin 27, and there were a lot, including Sheila, they didn't hear anything, and they're only 15 feet away. 12-year-old Justin was allowed to go back home to cabin 26 unsupervised by himself.
Sure. Why not?
He walked home, and he woke up his mom, and he told his mom what happened. The police then questioned Justin's mom and stepdad in cabin 26 and asked them if they'd heard anything. They told the police that they went to the Keddie backdoor bar around 10 o'clock with a friend of theirs named Bo, who'd been staying on their couch, and they had some drinks. And when they walked by Sue's house, it did seem darker than normal. Bo and Marty, the stepdad, walked Marilyn, Justin's mom, home from the bar around 11 o'clock, and they didn't hear anything unusual then. After 1 o'clock, Marty and Bo decided to go back to Keddie's backdoor bar and have a couple more drinks until closing time. And again, on their way to the bar and on their way back, which was around maybe 1:30, they didn't hear or see anything unusual. While the police were investigating and the organized crime unit was flying in on a helicopter for this homicide in the tiny town of Keddie, Justin began telling his mom some details of the crime that he says he remembers from, quote-unquote, a dream he had. Justin tried to tell everybody over and over again, Tina's missing. 12-year-old Tina is missing. And no one paid any attention. The police did not notice that 12-year-old Tina was missing until about half of the day had passed. And it didn't occur to anybody that Tina was missing because you had the 3 boys that were safe and there was just so much chaos. The FBI got called in now because they were convinced that Tina was kidnapped. Keep in mind, in the interim, Justin is telling him these details of this dream he had. Sheriff Doug Thomas took Justin into the backseat of his car because it was really raining outside. And he talked to Justin. Then the sheriff decided he was going to try to hypnotize Justin because he'd gone to two classes on it. So he was going to try it out and see what happened. Under hypnosis, Justin talked about the events that led up to the murder that night. Then he said that he had this dream, and it involved a boat. And there were two men on the boat with Johnny and Dana. And Johnny and Dana were fighting the two men, and the two men threw Johnny and Dana overboard. Sue was also on the boat, and one of the men stabbed her in the chest with a pocket knife. This man also had a hammer in his hand. And of course, what's interesting about it is hammer was used in the crime, and Sue was stabbed in the chest. In Justin's dream, he dreamt that he covered up Sue with a blanket.
Okay, that's a little creepy.
And remember, I told you there was blood on the boy's doorknob.
And he supposedly didn't see the crime scene, right?
Right.
Because they took him out the window.
Yes. Justin was hypnotized again, this time by a professional.
Excellent.
It was a doctor and a psychologist. Under hypnosis, he stated that Tina woke up and went into the living room, and she had a blanket in her hand. A man grabbed her, carried her through the kitchen and out the back door and down the stairs. Then the man came back in and removed a hunting knife that was stuck into the wall and left the house again. There are a lot of theories about what took place in that house. Of course, originally the police interviewed Sue's ex-husband. Given his violent past, they wanted to make sure that James didn't come back and slaughter his family. He had an alibi, and remember, he was from Connecticut. They began speculating that perhaps Tina was the focus of the crime because she's missing. So they started really examining Tina and Tina's life. Tina was 12 years old. She had some learning disabilities. She was a little bit slower. She was small for her age. But by all accounts, she was a very nice, really kind, loving girl. She had beautiful blue eyes and blonde hair. The year prior to the murders, Tina and another little girl accused a man in the trailer park that they had lived in of molesting them. And that was an ongoing situation. The police questioned this man, and he had an alibi. Then the police began focusing on Tina's special ed school teacher. This guy had a really over-the-top interest in Tina. On his desk, he had a picture of Tina.
That's weird.
At his house, he had a picture of Tina.
Did he really?
He had a picture of Tina. He eventually got cleared because he had an airtight alibi. But on an interesting note, years later, he was arrested for molesting a girl under the age of 14. So he's a creeper. He just didn't commit this crime. Police wondered if maybe these murders were somehow related to drugs. Keddie, there wasn't a lot of employment there because there wasn't anything there. So that area had a big drug problem. But when they searched Sue's house, there were no drugs found anywhere in the house. There were no drugs in her system and no drugs in Johnny's system. I'm not sure if there were drugs in Dana's system. Dana had been accused of stealing some LSD like 6 months earlier from somebody. But that's about the only connection they could find with anything to do with drugs. So I pretty much think, okay, it's not drugs. They also looked into some of Sue's former lovers. She had this one particular lover that drank a lot, and he would fight with Sue. They would have loud arguments. But he had an alibi. Then there was also the question of maybe it was a satanic cult. Because, you know, this is back in the early 80s.
I was going to say it's the 80s.
Now that got dispelled too. Police again questioned the neighbors. They even had Justin's stepdad, Marty, and his friend, Bo, because they were some shady characters, take polygraphs, which they passed. Marty was a drug dealer. That's how he supported his family. And Marty had just been on the psychiatric ward of a veterans hospital in Reno a few weeks earlier, where he met Bo. But again, they both passed polygraphs, so they were cleared. This case went cold. No arrests were made. Then on April 22nd, in 1984, 3 years and 11 days after the murder, a man who was collecting antique bottles was walking in a very remote part of the woods known as Feather River Falls, which is about 50 miles from Keddie, when he stumbled upon a skull and a few bones. The police came to the scene. They assumed originally that it was a skull and some bones of a Native American. They sent it to a forensic specialist. While the doctor, Dr. Murad, was examining the bones, something strange happened. The Butte County Dispatch, and Butte County is the county next over from Plumas, where Keddie is. The Butte County Dispatch got an anonymous phone call. This anonymous caller said he was watching the news and he saw how they had discovered the skull in the woods. And he said, quote, "And I was wondering if the police thought of the murder up in Keddie, up in Plumas County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found," end quote.
That's kind of weird.
Never even occurred to the police. They thought it was
50
Native
miles away.
And they thought it was Native American bones. The police have determined that whoever made that call knew that that was Tina, because the bones were identified in June of 1984 to have been from Tina. And the little bit of bones that they had, there was no way to ascertain how Tina died. The police went back out to the site where the skull was found and those small bones, and they found more bones. They also found jeans, a blue jacket, an empty medical tape dispenser, and a blanket. Something I would like to point out is, why is an antique bottle collector in a remote part of the woods?
I wondered that as well when you said it. I thought, well, that's a strange place to look for antique bottles.
Just something to think about. After the discovery of Tina, it really didn't make the investigators any closer to finding the perpetrator or perpetrators of the crime. This case went cold and stayed cold pretty much until maybe 2013. In 2013, the sheriff of Plumas County, he hired a private investigator named Mike Gamberg to take on the role of Plumas County Sheriff's special investigator, specifically to investigate this case. Special investigator Mike Gamberg started reviewing the evidence, and what he discovered was mind-blowing. The evidence was completely unorganized. He called the case, quote, "as screwed up as a soup sandwich."
I like that.
Right? I know. That's why I had to put that in there. I'm like, that's a good one.
I'm going to use that someday.
Some of the evidence had been destroyed in a freezer because a freezer got shut off. The case history log, where if you're going to take some evidence out and bring it back and you log it in, that was missing. During the renewed investigation, more evidence was found too, which is really exciting. The special investigator was able to piece together what he believes happened on the night of the murders, who he believed committed the murders, and why they committed the murders. And I'm going to tell you his theory after the shameless plug.
All right.
Okay, we'll be back. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Please tell me.
In all these boxes of evidence in the evidence room, Investigator Gamberg found a plethora of information to go on in his new investigation. There was an unopened envelope, a sealed envelope, and inside it was a tape recording, and it was a tape of the anonymous phone call. It had never even been logged as evidence. He gave that to the FBI. He's hoping that they'll analyze it because he believes a voice on the recording will match a recording the sheriff department already has in their possession of an interview of a suspect. And we'll get to this person. I don't know exactly when, but in relatively recent years, one of the knives used to kill the victims was found in a pile of debris by the old Keddie store that is now closed down.
Been sitting there all this time?
Believe it or not, yes, it's been sitting there all this time. In 2016, there was a man who was using a metal detector to go over a dry pond. He was looking for someone's wedding ring when he stumbled upon a hammer this hammer is a claw hammer, and they believe that this claw hammer was actually used in the murders. At the time of the murders, this dried pond was an actual full-fledged pond near the front entrance of the Keddie Resort in 1981. Apparently, it had never been searched by authorities. Even better than that, Tanya, they took a strip from that medical adhesive tape I was telling you about, and they submitted it, and they found DNA, and they get a hit on that DNA, and it is a match for someone that is still alive, and you're going to be surprised when I tell you who it is. In addition, in the evidence, there was information that a counselor had contacted the sheriff's department in 1981 to tell them that one of his patients confessed to the murders. It should be noted that a counselor doesn't have to honor the whole patient privilege in situations where someone confesses to murder, so note to self. The Department of Justice interviewed this counselor in May of 1981, and he gave them great details of the confession. It was from a patient of his on his 7th session. The patient's name was Marty. He was the stepfather of Justin.
Dun, dun,
Dun,
dun.
dun. And I'm going to tell you what the counselor told the Department of Justice in 1981 about what he was told by his patient, Marty. Marty, so you have a little background, has a temper. He gets angry. He went to Vietnam, but he never saw any battles. He was a cook. It was believed he was going to the Veterans Administration to try to pretend he had PTSD so he could get disability. Marty began meeting with this therapist a little before the murders. In a few of the sessions, he referred to this problem he was having with a woman he called an extreme bitch. The counselor doesn't remember who this woman was. Marty told the counselor he thought this woman was meddling with his marriage and that she was encouraging Marty's wife to leave Marty. Because Marty is a loser, for the record.
Just saying.
He had a temper. He tried to run over his wife with a car once. He was physically violent. He was going to blow up his dad one time and actually bought stuff to make a bomb. And he was cheating on his wife. But his wife was cheating on him.
Okay.
On the 7th session, Marty told this counselor, quote, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." In his interview with the Department of Justice, the therapist said that when Marty talked about the death of Sue, his affect was monotone and it was flat. It only became more animated when he talked about the murder of Tina. The counselor asked him, "Why did you kill Tina?" And Marty said, quote, "She saw the whole thing and I couldn't have a witness." Marty also told the therapist that he was really good friends with Sheriff Doug Thomas. In fact, he'd lived with him for a few weeks when Marty and Marilyn were having marital problems, and he even went on patrol with him. It makes you kind of question if the sheriff didn't want to believe Marty could be in on it, so he kind of didn't pursue that angle. Marty didn't act alone. When Marty confessed, he didn't say exactly who did the crimes with him, but I'm confident in the statement that Bo, his newfound friend from the psych ward, was his accomplice, at least one of them. Marty also told the therapist that he took a lie detector test, him and his friend Bo did, and they passed, and he started laughing basically and said it's super easy to pass those. Apparently, the two special investigators from the Organized Crime Unit of the Department of Justice deemed the counselor's information to be hearsay, and that's why they didn't pursue it further. Nothing happened in 1981. They let it go. Let me tell you a little bit about his friend, Bo. And Bo and Marty are dead. Bo died in 1988, and Marty died in 2000. So it's pretty easy to say whatever I want about him now. So I'm going to tell y'all right now, Bo and Marty killed them. Spoiler alert. But it gets really much more complex when you find out that Bo has ties to organized crime in Chicago. Bo grew up in Chicago, and his de facto father, his name was Jim Reaney, was an enforcer for the Chicago outfit.
Like an organized crime family?
I don't know. I'm not an organized crime specialist. It was an organized crime family, mob, mafia. It was one of those. There appears to be evidence that Bo worked in Las Vegas as an enforcer. He had talked to people about killing before. Some people question if the reason why the organized crime unit was involved in this is because maybe Bo was an informant for them. And maybe, now this is big conspiracy theory, guys. Maybe they didn't want to risk losing Bo, so they messed up the investigation. That is a theory out there. There's a very strong theory. Sounds crazy to me, but there's a lot of facts to back it up. I don't want to spend an hour going over them with you guys. Just trust me on this. Google it. There's a lot of info. Marty and Bo claim to have met each other in the psych ward of a veterans hospital. There are records for Marty being in that psych ward, but there are no records for Bo being in that psych ward. There's so much shadiness in regards to Marty and Bo and just their relationship in general. Apparently, the two are inseparable. They would wear sunglasses all the time and hung out 24/7 like BFFs. The DOJ did interview Marty and Bo together, which is odd to interview potential suspects together. The interviews took place the day after the murders. To me, one of the most telling bits of evidence against Marty and Bo has to do with the conversation they had with the Department of Justice the day after the murders during that one interview. In that interview, Marty was asked if it's possible Justin could have seen the murders. To which Marty responds, quote, "He is quiet enough to where he could have noticed something without me detecting him," end quote.
Well, that's odd to place yourself there at the scene of the crime.
Right?
And say the kids
and they
saw
didn't
you.
follow up on it.
Right.
He also said, "I understand that a hammer was used to kill them, and someone stole my claw hammer a couple days ago."
Really?
They were like, "Oh, that's interesting. Oh, have a good day, sir."
Yeah.
Do you want to know the gist of what most likely happened that night based on the theories by the people that have invested the most time investigating these murders?
Of course I do.
And why?
Yes.
I'm going to tell you.
I am sitting here on the edge of my seat. I just want to tell you.
And for the record, this is my interpretation of their interpretation of events, okay? The motive behind the murders was probably one of the most common themes you find in murders. Jealousy and infidelity. There's a strong likelihood that Sue was actually having sexual relations with Marty. And Marilyn found out, and she was pissed. In addition, Marty didn't like women, and he had a rage against women. So I'm sure that added to it. In the weeks prior to the murder, he reached out to some friends and said that he was basically worried he was going to kill somebody, that he was going to snap. Also, he didn't like Johnny at all. He had a general disdain for all teenagers, but particularly Johnny. He had threatened to even smash Johnny's hands. On the night of April 11th, the lead theory goes that Marty, Marilyn, and Bo went to the bar, as we know they did. Then they left the bar and they went to Cabin 28. They went in and they attacked Sue in her bed. They weren't expecting Justin to be at the house because they were out at the bar. These were not parents of the year, okay? Rumor has it that Justin just decided to go over and stay the night there, and they didn't know till they were already in the cabin. And he popped out. Tina woke up and walked out into the living room and saw what happened, so she was grabbed. And Marty told the therapist he incapacitated Tina before he took her out. And she was probably killed immediately or right after being taken out the back steps of the cabin and then placed most likely in the trunk of a car. She might have been carried over the swinging bridge and placed in a wooded area. That's a possibility too. And the next day, Marty and Bo, along with their friend D. Lake, probably drove and dumped Tina's body in the woods, where her remains were found, along with the other items found by her body. They were gone for hours that day. I can't confirm D. Lake was with them, but I'm almost certain his car was what they used. Now, most likely, the teen boys, Dana and Johnny, they got dropped off and they walked in, and there was Sue being assaulted by Bo and Marty. Maybe even Marilyn was there. Sue was probably gagged already. They didn't need to gag Dana and Johnny because with Sue being threatened, they're probably going to do whatever the perpetrators want them to do, include being quiet. That explains why Sue is the only one gagged. Johnny probably tried to save his mom and was attacked. Dana took off running, got hit in the back of the head, was placed on the chair next to the telephone, and Sue was forced to watch Johnny get beat up and sliced and tied up and bound with Dana. Sue also saw what happened to Tina. We know for a fact there was more than just Marty, Bo, and probably Marilyn at the crime scene. Do you know who the DNA match was on the medical adhesive tape I told you that they found? It matched the 12-year-old boy, Justin.
I was going to guess Justin.
It matched Justin.
That is fucking weird.
So they don't know was he forced to participate in it to scare him? Can't tell on us because you did it. Or did he touch it maybe when he put the blanket over Sue's body? On the morning of August 12th, when Sheila and Jamie claimed to have found those boys sleeping, Ricky, Greg, and Justin, it's pretty likely those boys were not sleeping. They were most likely cowering in the closet, freaking out. And Sheila and Jamie probably were told by those boys what happened. I mean, at least Justin, we knows what happened. And so, to protect the boys, for the boys' own good, Sheila and or Jamie probably told the boys to just say you were asleep. The question is why still say they were asleep? I don't know. Maybe they believe it now. Maybe the boys were all forced to participate in the crime. I don't have the exact reason, but pretty much nobody believes these boys were sleeping through that crime.
Good Lord.
This is how deep it goes.
Gosh. Yeah.
In addition, the knife marks that were on the walls, those were on the opposite side of where the closet in the boys' room was. So the belief is that those knives were thrown into the wall partly to scare those boys. After the initial attack, Bo and Marty left and they went back to the bar to probably establish an alibi. And this is after 1 o'clock. So the question becomes, who was watching everybody in the cabin when they were gone? Was it Marilyn? Was it a friend of Marty's named Dee? Was it a friend of Marty's named Tony? There's a lot of names that have been put out there. I'm sure there was someone else in there watching them while Bo and Marty established an alibi. When they went back to the bar, they put on suits, 3-piece suits, and sunglasses. And people and police theorize they did that so they would stand out. Because in Keddie, guys, at the bar, you don't wear suits. They were at the bar for one drink, and then they went back to the cabin where they continued their torture and violence. Sue was probably forced to walk around and look at Dana and Johnny. This probably ended sometime around 3:30. So an important question to ask is, why would they take Tina out of the cabin? What's the point? The main theory is that Tina was taken as a red herring to throw off the investigation. So instead of focusing on Sue and what happened there at the scene, they were focusing on Tina. There's some other theories out there. Some believe that Johnny and Dana were in the basement and ran upstairs when they heard a scream, probably from Tina. There are other people out there that theorize that Marty didn't have anything to do with it, but I find that to be extremely unlikely. There's so many other little details that I just didn't want to get into, but there's much more evidence pointing to Marty and Bo, and probably Marilyn, and probably Marty's friends. In the end, they believe there are at least 6 people involved.
6?
Between actually committing the murder and then helping dispose of the evidence. There's still obviously a lot of unanswered questions. But I think it's really important that people pay attention to this story because as of right now, there is no special investigator anymore. The case is not being investigated by the county. It's only private individuals that are looking into this case. In the end, who knows exactly what happened that night? Besides Justin. I don't know.
Girl, I just heard this story today. I have no idea. This whole story is messed up. Well, thank you, Talia.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to that. Again, I know it's not solved. I loved solved cases. But I'm pretty confident we at least know 2 people involved. And they're dead. And they didn't live happily ever after lives, in case you thought they did. They didn't. Their lives sucked balls.
Is Marilyn still alive?
She is still alive.
I bet you she's got some shit to say, too.
Oh, girl, go on YouTube. Marilyn got so much shit to say.
Oh.
All it is just spewing shit. She started talking about a bloody jacket. She's alive. Justin's alive. Sheila's got a book out. She's in documentaries. There's so much information on this.
How come I've never heard of it?
I don't know.
Because it's a crazy story.
It's crazy. I got all my information pretty much from the Plumas News. It's the online edition of Feather Publishing Newspapers. They had a 3-part series. It was fascinating. I also went to these different forums, and that's where the shit just gets crazy. If you want to see some pictures or find out more information, you can go to our website, tntcrimes.com, or they can find us
on Facebook, Instagram, at TNT Crimes.
Lots of places. TNT Crimes.
Until next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Tune in.